What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the fighting game tutorial series, we are going to be working with our pause menu to improve it and incorporate the practice settings option. That way we can actually use that widget that we created a couple episodes ago. So if we go to versus mode, select our characters and our stage, come in here and pause the game, we have resume, command list, rematch, and main menu. We don't have the ability to get to practice settings. Now, if we go back to our main menu, and this time we go to practice mode, same thing, characters and stages. When we load in here and pause the game, we have this new section called Practice Settings. Now note that Practice Settings was not part of the menu in the Versus section, but it is here in the Practice section, and these are the same widget. Now we can either confirm with the keyboard or press on Practice Settings with our mouse, and you'll see that we are in our Practice Settings widget, and we can actually navigate it as well. So we had created this Practice Settings widget in previous episodes in the series, but we never were able to actually navigate to it. We were hard coding it and testing it. Now we can actually get to it properly, and we're going to be able to modify the different buttons in our pause menu within one widget. We don't need to make multiple widgets for multiple pause menus unless you want to do that. If you want to get caught up in the series before checking out this episode so you can do everything that we can do from throws, projectiles, and hitboxes, you can click this icon in the top right corner right here to get started on that. Alternatively, if you only care about the pause menu stuff, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to watch the whole series to implement this. I do recommend you watch practice settings episodes because we did set up the practice settings widget in there, and we're not actually going to be modifying that widget in today's episode. So knowing how that widget works before implementing this episode's content will help you out. Even that is not required though. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series, but we're only going to be dealing with the blueprints, modifying these widgets. So first things first, we want to go to our versus pause menu. So versus pause menu is a widget, so I go to blueprints, widgets, menus, versus pause menu. Now it looks a little bit different than last time because last time I just had these buttons hard coded to certain positions. Now I've added them to a vertical box. That way I can add them dynamically or remove them dynamically. You don't technically have to do it this way. There are a lot of ways you could handle this behavior. But if you do want to use my method, we will need a vertical box. So vertical box is under panel, or you can search for it in a palette and say vertical box. And I brought that into my canvas panel that I have for my pause menu. I've called it menu options vertical box and made it a variable because we are going to be using it in the graph. I anchored it to the center anchor. That way it is in the center of the screen, but you can anchor it where you want it. I gave it a position of 0, 0 because I want it to be directly in the center. And I left the sizes alone because I was allowing it to size to content. But I actually think I'm going to change this a little bit. So instead of sizing to content, let's actually just say the size X is 600 and the size Y is 500. Either way would work, but I do like the appearance of this a little bit more because the buttons are a little bit bigger and it's not so smushed in the screen. So that's an on-the-fly change I made. Of course, make it look however you want. For the alignment, I use 0.5 and 0.5 because that changes where the origin is, or really the anchor point that's being used for this. So if you leave this at 0, 0, it's going to use the top left, which is the origin, but I want it to be directly in the middle with these values. So I set my alignment to 0.5 and 0.5 because it is a ratio of the X and Y. Everything else about this vertical box is perfectly fine. Unless you want to change it, you can leave it alone. Take all the buttons I had on this widget and put them within the vertical box. So I had a resume button, a command list button, a rematch button, and a quit to main menu button. They all have an associated text widget. I've also added a new button today. You can duplicate one of the other buttons or just set up another one, and this is my practice settings button. So it's just a standard button type, common button. A practice settings button, made it a variable. Here's all my behavior for it. Those are all my design choices for it. Then I have a text element, which is a child of that widget. I've called it practice settings button text. Does not need to be a variable because I'm not going to change the text on it. You can see all my settings here. For the text, I just say practice settings. Here's my font, justification. Now, add it where you want in this vertical box. So I put it above quit to main menu, but below everything else. And basically, if this is practice mode that we're in, I want this button to show up, but if it's not, I want to hide it. But then I have the ability to remove it once the pause menu is created if we don't want it. The vertical box will automatically resize and reposition the elements in the container to actually look how we want it to look. So once your changes to the design view are done, we can go into the graph. At this point, we can go to event construct, which is where this widget is created. And after all the logic that we had in here, I've added some new logic today. That's everything you see on the screen that's highlighted here. So I'm getting my game instance and casting it to our game instance type because our game instance has this game mode type variable, which determines if it is versus, practice, story, arcade, or online that we're currently in. So get game instance cast to base game instance, drag off of that game mode type, get it, drag off of this not equal to or exclamation mark equal to enum. This allows us to choose our type. We want to make sure that we're not equal to practice if we're going to remove it. So that's how we get these nodes here. And then I'm going to drag off of the result, bring it into a branch, and only if it's true that it's not equal to practice do we want to remove it. At this point, we will grab our menu options vertical box, get it, call remove child, and pass in our practice settings button. That's how you get all of this logic right here. At that point, the pause menu will be able to be dynamic. It will actually show the results and options to the user that we want based on the game mode. Now we have to handle things like navigating through them since our hierarchy has changed a little bit. Let's go back to the designer and go to your practice settings button. Scroll all the way down to the bottom and make sure you add the onPressed event by pressing the plus right here. Then it will create it somewhere. Here's mine. I'm also going to make a custom event for what happens when we select it with our in-game inputs. So if we're not using the mouse, but instead our keyboard or controller inputs. So I have my onPress practice settings button. I'm going to add custom event and call it selected practice settings. And that's what I have here. Now in these two events, all we're going to do for today's episode is create the widget and add it to the viewport. Of course, there's more that we will do with this, but as long as we can get it on the viewport and navigate through it, we're actually good to go for today's episode. I won't go any farther than that. We can do this by calling create widget, selecting the class as practice settings, dragging off the return value and adding it to the viewport. And that's how we get these two events right here. We also are going to want to go to determine button to focus, display hovered selection, and confirm selection. These three functions all require a couple of changes if practice settings is there to make things work. So first of all is determine button to focus. So when we come in here, we were using the current selection that the player was on, performing a switch on integer, and then returning the proper button. Now technically that would be correct if all of these settings were available. If practice settings is hidden, then quit to main menu button becomes index 3 here. So we would have to shift these things down. So instead of adding practice settings button like I did here for today's episode, we're going to actually just remove this flat out. We're going to use our current P1 selection and we're going to get the valid index in our vertical box instead. So get the menu options vertical box and get child at. So current P1 selection is going to be the index for that. Now, this returns a widget object reference. We do know that all of our options right now are buttons. So I can drag off my return value and cast it to a button. And at this point, I can then return the button because that's what we were returning before. So add return node. And for some reason, my return node does not have my button type in here. So we can just make a new one. Button. Let's say focused button, and we will make it a button object reference and pass in the casted button. because of that little strangeness that occurred with the output parameter, I'm going to have to go to move selection and fix up my determine button to focus call. So instead of using current button, we're going to use focus button. But anyway, this is determine button to focus now. The next thing we want to go to is the display hovered selection function. Now in here, we were making an array of all of our buttons, and of course we need to include our practice settings button now. So we had resume, command list, rematch, and quit to main menu. I've added a new pin right here and then passed in the practice settings button, just like this, and then move the quit to main menu button down one. This one doesn't really require any additional changes because everything here will still work. We're going to loop through every element in this array and check if it is the selected button from the determine button to focus function. Then we have our confirm selection. So if we go to confirm selection, we were doing something very similar where we had the current P1 selection being used on a switch, and then we were calling the appropriate function. Now, instead of doing a switch on an integer, we could actually check the specific button that we're grabbing. So that's what we're going to do. We can still use our current P1 selection, and we can use our menu options vertical box again. We can get the child and pass in current P1 selection. Then we can drag off the return value and see if it's equal to each of our buttons. Additionally, you could cast it to a button first and then see if it's equal. Either way should work. So we'll just go about this in the same order that we were already. So for the first one, we will check our resume button. And we'll bring it into a branch. If it's true, we will say selected resume. If it's false, we will continue the checks. So we will bring this over here, equal. Next is the command list button. If it's true, we go to selected command list. And so on and so forth. We're going to keep this chain up. There certainly are cleaner ways you could do this, but I do think this is one of the easiest to understand. That way we know exactly where each button is regardless of how many elements we have, because we may want to have different elements for our story pause menu and things like that as well. So for this one, we want to go to our rematch button. If it's true, we want to go into selected rematch. This one is going to be our practice settings button. So we're calling selected practice settings, and then lastly we have our selected main menu. This one is going to be our quit to main menu button. And we're going to select the main menu if it is true. And something like that will do the trick. Nice little steps we got there. There's one more thing we want to do, and that is update max selections. So max selections is a variable that we use when moving selections. That way we don't go outside the bounds. And the problem with this is this was a hard-coded number we were setting to 4. Now we want to set it to all the buttons in the vertical box. So if we go to the end of event construct, either after removing the child or in the false part of the branch, we want to then set max selections to the number of children in the vertical box. So set max selections, and I'm just going to grab my menu options vertical box again here. Get children count. And pass that into max selections. So now it should work whether we play versus or practice, or really any mode. So versus, I can pause it, and my mouse works for all of them. I can also navigate through all of them, and I should actually go back to the main menu when I press 1 here. That's how you know we've done it correctly. Otherwise, that would have opened the practice settings. Now let's go to practice. And pause the game. You see that it is working. If we click 1 to go on the practice settings, we go to the practice settings. And now we are good to go. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this episode on improving your practice settings and pause menu in general. If you did, please subscribe and consider joining the Patreon, YouTube membership, or Discord tiers. You'll get extra benefits like these series when they're up on the Epic Marketplace, and it supports the channel a lot. If you ran into any problems while following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description, and that support is completely free. Otherwise, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.